Why, though, has the Islamic world sunk to its present condition? A number of explanations are offered, none of them individually quite persuasive. Sometimes we find a very pragmatic explanation in the fact that the prevalence of the West really was cemented through the Industrial Revolution, which gave the West the military edge when the old Ottoman crossbows and arquebuses simply couldn't hold the line. And the Industrial Revolution really couldn't have happened in the Muslim world because you didn't happen to have places where you had plenty of fresh water, plenty of iron ore close to the surface, and plenty of coal, the things that you need for a basic development of the steam engine. In the Islamic world, there's nowhere like that. Maybe a few corners of Turkey, but basically it was northern France, Picardy, and England where that happened. That's one possible explanation. Another one is that Islamic law does not favor great accumulations of capital, partly because of the zakat system. Another may lie in the fact that military attitudes in the Islamic world, because they had this chivalric idea, almost the samurai ethic of the warrior, not being a brute, but being a very refined creature, that this made Muslims rather bad at assimilating advances, both in military organization and in military technology. If you've seen Kurosawa's famous film, The Seven Samurai, you may recall that the greatest samurai of all, this man who's in such a state of detachment that he can go out and kill a couple of bandits and then immediately fall asleep, that this man is eventually defeated not by a sword but by a bullet. Kurosawa's argument is that it's the intrusion of Western technology that's destroying the old military ethos and creating a new, rather sinister type of Japan. And I think that has a lot to do with the reason why the Muslim world was so slow to adapt to Western military technology and why the Ottoman Empire from the 18th century on continued to contract. So strong was this idea that you really had to be face to face with your enemy, that, for instance, the British, when they landed at Gallipoli in 1915, were amazed to find that the Turks would hold their fire until the British had actually beached. They were very vulnerable in these boats before they had landing craft, and the Turks had machine guns and lined the coast. But the Turks never opened fire unless they saw that the British enemy was in a position to defend itself. And that kind of ethos doesn't really help you to win wars under modern conditions. The samurai and their Islamic equivalent, who are really these guys called the Janissaries in the Islamic world, a particularly Turkish institution. The Janissaries, the inventors of military music. One of Mozart's operas introduces some Janissary band instruments to the Western orchestra. The triangle, the kettle drum, for instance, are Janissary instruments. These were people who basically were Sufis and who received spiritual and also literary education before they were allowed into battle. And this was the Praetorian Guard of the Caliphate of the Ottoman state. And a Janissary was not allowed into battle unless he had passed an exam showing that he could compose metrically correct poetry in Persian, Turkish, and Arabic. This was the idea that the Ottomans had of the sort of gentleman warrior. And nowadays, or at least from the 18th century onwards, and with Clausewitz and the Napoleonic revolution in how war took place, when civilian populations were increasingly targeted, which for traditional civilizations was often regarded as disgraceful, this kind of ethos really couldn't hold its own. And that's one explanation that's offered.
Is this the group that I heard the story about that they were mainly Christian orphans that were raised?
That's right. The Turkish system, which didn't even pretend to be compatible with Islamic law, was that the Turks may have supplied auxiliary forces, and in the early period, light cavalry, but the 10 or 15,000 man standing army around the Sultan would be made up of these Janissaries who were taken from usually Christian villages at the age of 9 or 10. Each village would have to pay a tax in every 10 years in the form of a number of young boys who would be taken to Istanbul and brought up as Muslims. And they formed these shock troops of the Ottoman Empire. And the only exception was Bosnia, where the Muslims were allowed to propose their own sons for inclusion in the Janissary levy. Of course, it was in many ways traumatic for them, but in many ways there were plenty of instances of officials being bribed to take children, because it was known that this was a way to high office. And the Grand Vizier in the golden ages of the Ottoman Empire was usually from the Janissary corps or some cognate institution. Interesting that the most militantly Islamic state in later Islamic history was almost entirely run by people of Christian background, and that the Turks were actually very disadvantaged in the Ottoman Empire politically.
Was it common for people from Slavic areas to be made slaves or slaves, or Slavic people to leave the Janissary?
Yeah, that's what I've just said. That usually these levies of young boys took place not just in the Slavic Balkans, they also took place in Greek villages in Anatolia. It's thought that Sinan, the famous architect who built the Suleymaniye, many of the great structures of Istanbul, was actually originally Greek and was brought up in this way. So there's some explanations for the decline of Islam. Another one might be sought in the fact that modernity and heavy industrialization and the whole mindset that we might describe simply as materialism and greed, more politely known as capitalism, can't really flourish perfectly where most people are really devoutly religious in a traditional sense, where the world is there really to be renounced or to be passed through rather than to be built up. And much of the military and economic power of Europe can be attributed, and is attributed by many historians, to the discrediting of religion that took place following the great wars of religion after the Reformation. That after years of massacres in France and elsewhere, people just said, well, we're just going to give up. And the French Revolution and the whole Jacobin mentality has a lot to do with that. It's a militant rejection of religion, and hence a doctrinaire materialism that certainly accelerated the growth of European power. Sort of Voltaire's contempt for traditional Catholicism is part of that. And that didn't happen in the Muslim world, because that kind of major, endless sectarian fighting didn't really have an equivalent amongst Muslims. There wasn't a comparable disillusionment amongst a certain elite with religion that might have generated a more materialistic, grasping worldview. In any case, the Islamic world is more or less oblivious to its backwardness until the calamity of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt happens at the end of the 18th century. And it becomes clear that he's really pushing on a door that's already been rotten for centuries. And he marches his cavalry into the Azhar Mosque in Cairo and generally humiliates the local population and provokes a crisis of confidence in the hitherto rather smug Muslim world that I suppose has endured to this day. Muslim responses to all of this, some of which are explicitly jihadist, with the decline of European colonial rule after the Second World War, we find that the national elites, which have been created in most cases as junior officer corps for colonial armies or as junior administrators for local colonial administrations, and have been to missionary schools or purely secular schools and are deliberately deracinated. They have been deliberately chosen to represent the values of the imperial power. These are the people upon whose shoulders devolves the mantle of political power. And that remains the case in most Muslim countries to this day. You have an enormous cultural divide between a relatively small, almost completely westernized, secularized ruling elite and the mass of the population in large urban areas or in the still densely populated countryside. So the first response was secularism and nationalism. Arab nationalism reaching its heyday with Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the United Arab Republic. You have another response which is associated particularly with a man called Muhammad Abdo, who was the Grand Mufti of Egypt around the turn of the last century. And Abdul's response was that we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We recognize that our traditional institutions have not served us and maintained our cultural or political independence, but we're not going to be out-and-out secularists or Arab Jacobins either. What we need is some form of reform, a reform that involves getting back to the spirit of early Islam and discounting many of the medieval details. And his movement is referred to as the Salafiyya, the Salaf being the earliest generation of Muslims. He thought if only we'd kept with the original, generous, liberating, fresh ideology of pristine Islam, we wouldn't be in this miserable situation. Well, the simplistic fundamentalist type of view, but these aren't rigorist fundamentalists. These are reformists, and Muhammad Abdo in particular did all kinds of interesting new things, such as, for instance, effectively banning polygamy as something whose conditions can no longer be met, revoking any traditional discriminatory legislation against non-Muslim minorities. The third of these responses could be described as a kind of fundamentalism, and this is a term we've had before, and it was really not very widely influential until the explosion of Saudi oil wealth in the 60s and 70s, when new universities were established in Saudi Arabia in order to promote this very uncompromising type of Salafiyya, back to the basics Islam, which is as unyielding and rigid as Muhammad Abdul's Salafiyya approach was relaxed and inclusive. So these are three responses, and basically the dilemma of any modern Muslim society is how to juggle these three more or less irreconcilable possibilities for the regeneration of Muslim society.